Hollywood has always known how to turn beauty into fame. But it has never been quite as comfortable when that beauty begins demanding authority. Elizabeth Taylor became one of the most recognizable faces in cinema history. Studios celebrated the image. Audiences admired the glamour. Yet behind that visibility was a quieter professional tension. When the industry sees you first as an icon, how do you convince it to see you as an artist? For Elizabeth Taylor, that question shaped an entire career, one defined not only by fame, but by the long effort to hold on to control inside an industry built on image. A long career has a way of revealing a quiet tension. The very thing that makes someone visible can also limit how seriously their work is taken. In Hollywood, few careers illustrate this more clearly than Elizabeth Taylor's. For decades, she was recognized instantly, her face, her presence, her fame. But that same visibility created a professional dilemma. When the industry sees you first as an icon, how do you prove you are also an artist? Elizabeth Taylor spent much of her career navigating that pressure, selecting roles that gradually shifted the conversation from image to authority. This story isn't about scandal or headlines. It's about how a performer built autonomy inside one of the most image-driven industries in the world. And in the process, she reshaped how Hollywood valued its stars. Let's take a closer look. Elizabeth Taylor's public image formed in an era when Hollywood operated under a very different professional structure than the one audiences recognize today. The studio system still held enormous influence, shaping not only which actors appeared in films but also how they were presented to the public. Careers were often built around carefully managed identities. Studios created recognizable archetypes, heroes, ingenues, leading men, glamorous women, and once an actor fit one of those molds, it became the lens through which their entire career was evaluated. For Elizabeth Taylor, the archetype arrived early and with unusual force. The industry quickly recognized that her presence on screen carried a visual impact that audiences immediately responded to. In a system designed to market recognizable images across theaters around the world, this made her enormously valuable. Publicity materials, magazine covers, and studio promotions consistently reinforced the same message: Elizabeth Taylor was not just another performer emerging from the studio pipeline. She was an icon of beauty. From a business perspective, this branding worked perfectly. Hollywood at the time relied heavily on international appeal, and a face that audiences could instantly recognize was an asset studios could export across markets. The more that image circulated, the more the industry reinforced it. The result was a feedback loop common in many professions. Early strengths became the defining label. But labels, even flattering ones, carry consequences. In the film industry, the danger of a powerful public image is that it can quietly limit how a performer's work is interpreted. When audiences enter a theater already expecting glamour, they often overlook the subtler dimensions of performance. Directors may also hesitate to cast actors in roles that challenge established perceptions. For Elizabeth Taylor, the risk was not invisibility. It was being seen too narrowly. This was the professional environment surrounding the first major turning point of her career. Taylor began gravitating toward roles that required emotional complexity rather than simply visual presence. These projects demanded dialogue-driven performances, intense interpersonal dynamics, and a willingness to explore characters with psychological depth. Instead of reinforcing the industry's expectations, they gradually expanded them. What made this shift notable was how carefully it unfolded. Taylor did not publicly reject the image Hollywood had created around her. Doing so would likely have triggered resistance from studios that depended on that image for marketing. Instead, she approached the problem strategically. While the industry continued presenting her as a glamorous figure, she began accumulating performances that required critics and audiences to look beyond that framing. Films built around strong dramatic writing offered that opportunity. Characters with internal conflict forced the audience to pay attention to voice, timing, emotional control, and intensity, qualities that cannot be reduced to appearance alone. As these roles accumulated, something subtle began to change. Reviews started mentioning her craft more frequently. Conversations about her work gradually shifted from admiration to evaluation. For professionals in any field, this moment can feel familiar. After years of being known for one defining strength, the challenge becomes demonstrating range without abandoning the reputation that created opportunity in the first place. Taylor's approach shows how that transition can happen quietly, through consistent decisions rather than dramatic declarations. Her early career, therefore, was not simply about rising fame. It was about navigating the tension between image and authority inside an industry built on visual identity. The first turning point came when she began using role selection as a tool, not to erase the icon Hollywood had created, but to slowly build something deeper beneath it. And as the industry began to notice that shift, the next phase of her career would push that transformation even further. If you find this kind of long career analysis interesting, stay with me as we continue exploring how Elizabeth Taylor reshaped her professional identity over time. As those performances began to shift critical attention, Elizabeth Taylor entered a new phase of her career, one where recognition brought with it a different kind of pressure. In Hollywood, success rarely simplifies a career. More often, it raises expectations that are harder to manage than obscurity ever was. Once an actor proves they are capable of serious dramatic work, every subsequent role becomes a test of whether that transformation was real or temporary. By the late studio era, Taylor was no longer viewed only as a marketable screen presence. She had demonstrated that she could carry emotionally demanding material, and that recognition changed how the industry approached her. Producers began attaching greater financial stakes to her films. Public attention intensified. Each project carried the implicit question of whether she could sustain the level of dramatic credibility she had begun to establish. This kind of pressure is not unique to film. In many professions, the first major success often becomes the benchmark against which all future work is measured. What once felt like a breakthrough can quietly turn into a new standard that must be maintained. For Taylor, the scale of public visibility made that dynamic even more complicated. Her career unfolded at a moment when Hollywood itself was transitioning. The traditional studio system that had once tightly controlled actors' careers was weakening. At the same time, mass media was expanding, and the personalities of film stars were becoming cultural phenomena in their own right. As a result, Taylor's professional identity existed in two parallel narratives. On one level, she was an increasingly respected dramatic actress taking on complex roles. On another level, she remained one of the most recognizable public figures in the entertainment industry. The two identities did not always reinforce each other. When fame expands beyond the work itself, audiences sometimes begin responding more to the persona than the performance. The risk is subtle but significant. Attention shifts away from craft and toward presence. For Taylor, this meant that even strong performances could occasionally be overshadowed by the scale of interest surrounding her. Yet this environment also revealed an important element of her professional strategy. Instead of attempting to withdraw from the public spotlight, Taylor appeared to accept that visibility as part of the terrain she was navigating. Rather than fighting the magnitude of her celebrity, she learned to operate within it. In practical terms, that meant continuing to select roles that demanded emotional investment and dramatic focus. Characters with psychological tension forced audiences and critics alike to engage with the work itself. Over time, this approach strengthened the perception that her talent was not an accident of a few well-chosen films but a sustained professional capability. For viewers who have spent decades building their own careers, this stage may feel particularly recognizable. Early recognition often opens the door to larger opportunities, but those opportunities bring scrutiny that did not exist before. Expectations rise, and maintaining credibility becomes as important as achieving it. Taylor's response to this environment demonstrated a certain professional discipline. She did not attempt to reinvent herself overnight, nor did she chase every available role to remain visible. Instead, she continued reinforcing the same direction she had begun earlier, performances that required seriousness and emotional weight. Gradually, the industry began to adjust its expectations as well. The conversation around Elizabeth Taylor was no longer limited to the image that had first brought her attention. It increasingly included discussion of her ability to sustain demanding dramatic roles across multiple productions. And that shift set the stage for another turning point. Because as her stature grew, so did her ability to influence the terms under which she worked, a development that would eventually change not just her own career, but how Hollywood understood the leverage of its biggest stars. If you're interested in how that next transformation unfolded, stay with me as we continue looking at the strategic decisions that shaped the later stages of Elizabeth Taylor's career. That growing recognition created an opportunity that many performers of her era never fully obtained: the ability to influence the terms of her own career. As the industry entered the 1960s, Elizabeth Taylor's position in Hollywood was no longer defined only by her performances or her public visibility. It was increasingly defined by leverage. Hollywood itself was undergoing structural change at this moment. The traditional studio system, which had once controlled actors through long-term contracts, was weakening. Studios were losing some of their centralized authority, and major productions were becoming larger financial gambles. In this shifting environment, the few performers who could guarantee global attention gained a different kind of bargaining power. Taylor recognized that reality earlier than many of her contemporaries. Rather than allowing studios to continue dictating the direction of her career, she began approaching projects from a position closer to partnership than employment. Her name, by that point, carried enormous international recognition. Producers understood that attaching Elizabeth Taylor to a film dramatically increased its visibility and commercial potential. That visibility became the foundation of her autonomy. The most important element of this transition was not simply financial negotiation, although compensation certainly became part of the conversation. What mattered more for long-term positioning was the shift in how Taylor engaged with projects. Instead of being placed into roles that fit a studio's existing plans, she increasingly selected projects that aligned with her evolving professional identity. This approach represented a quiet but significant change in power dynamics. Earlier in her career, studios had largely determined the structure of her work. Now, her participation itself could shape the structure of a production. For professionals outside the entertainment industry, the principle may sound familiar. After decades of experience, authority often comes not from holding a formal title but from possessing influence that others recognize they need. In Taylor's case, influence came from a combination of reputation, audience recognition, and demonstrated performance capability. One of the most visible examples of this shift occurred during the production of large-scale films in which her involvement carried enormous symbolic weight. The industry began treating her not merely as a performer within a film but as a central component of the project's identity. Marketing campaigns, international distribution strategies, and production decisions often revolved around her presence. That level of visibility could have easily trapped an actor inside spectacle-driven productions that emphasized scale over substance. Yet Taylor's long-term positioning suggests that she remained aware of the balance she had been managing since the beginning of her career, the tension between image and authority. Rather than abandoning dramatic roles in favor of prestige productions alone, she continued to pursue performances that demanded emotional intensity and complex character dynamics. Maintaining that balance allowed her to expand her autonomy without losing the artistic credibility she had spent years building. This phase of her career illustrates an important dimension of professional longevity. Authority rarely arrives suddenly. More often, it emerges gradually as an individual accumulates enough credibility, recognition, and strategic clarity to influence the environment around them. Taylor's repositioning did not eliminate the pressures that came with global fame. Public attention remained immense, and the scale of productions associated with her continued to grow. But the relationship between the performer and the industry had shifted. She was no longer simply navigating the expectations placed upon her. She was helping shape them. In doing so, Elizabeth Taylor demonstrated a form of professional autonomy that was still relatively rare in Hollywood at the time. Her career began within a tightly controlled studio structure. By mid-career, she had transformed her visibility into negotiating power and her negotiating power into strategic choice. That repositioning would ultimately prove essential for sustaining her influence across decades, because the next challenge of a long career is not simply maintaining authority, but deciding how that authority should be used. Yet autonomy in a long career rarely depends only on professional negotiations. Over time, personal decisions, how visible to remain, how often to work, and how to adapt to an evolving industry begin shaping the long-term trajectory just as strongly as individual performances. For Elizabeth Taylor, this stage of her career unfolded under one of the most difficult conditions any public figure faces: aging in full public view. Hollywood has historically struggled with longevity for actresses. The industry tends to celebrate youth intensely while offering fewer roles that acknowledge maturity. For performers whose early careers were strongly associated with visual glamour, this transition can be especially complex. The public image that once accelerated success may later become a benchmark the industry expects to remain unchanged. Taylor confronted this structural reality in a way that revealed another layer of professional recalibration. Rather than attempting to compete indefinitely within the same framework that defined her early career, she gradually shifted how she positioned herself in relation to Hollywood. Part of that shift involved pacing. As the decades progressed, her film appearances became less frequent. This was not simply a matter of withdrawing from the industry but of redefining the terms of participation. Instead of maintaining constant visibility through a high volume of projects, Taylor's presence became more selective. For long-career professionals, this pattern often emerges naturally. Early and mid-career stages frequently emphasize accumulation, building experience, expanding recognition, establishing authority. Later phases tend to prioritize sustainability, deciding which opportunities align with one's long-term identity and which simply maintain momentum without adding meaningful value. Taylor's approach reflected that recalibration. By choosing fewer roles, she allowed each appearance to carry greater weight. When she did return to the screen, the public conversation often focused not only on the project itself but also on the enduring significance of her presence. At the same time, she expanded the ways in which her influence could operate outside the traditional boundaries of film performance. Public advocacy, philanthropy, and humanitarian work became increasingly central to how audiences encountered her in later decades. These activities did not replace her career in cinema, rather, they broadened the meaning of her public platform. This shift also addressed another challenge common to highly visible careers: sustaining relevance across generational change. As new performers emerged and the style of filmmaking evolved, many actors from earlier eras found their cultural presence gradually narrowing. Taylor's continued public engagement helped prevent that contraction. Even when she appeared less frequently in films, her name remained associated with leadership, advocacy, and public influence. For audiences who had followed her career over decades, this transformation reinforced a sense of continuity. The qualities that had defined her earlier presence, confidence, visibility, and authority, remained recognizable, even as the arenas in which they appeared expanded. The question of aging in public view often carries an implicit tension between nostalgia and relevance. Some figures become symbols of a past era, remembered primarily for what they once represented. Others manage to carry their presence forward in ways that connect earlier achievements to new forms of influence. Taylor's later career decisions suggest an awareness of this distinction. By allowing her professional life to evolve rather than attempting to preserve a static image, she maintained a degree of relevance that extended well beyond the peak years of her filmography. Seen across the full arc of her career, these personal recalibrations demonstrate that longevity rarely depends on resisting change. More often, it requires recognizing when to redefine one's role within an evolving landscape. Elizabeth Taylor's ability to adjust the rhythm of her work, broaden the scope of her public engagement, and sustain authority in the face of shifting expectations became a defining element of how her career endured across multiple eras of Hollywood. Seen across the full arc of Elizabeth Taylor's career, what stands out is not simply the scale of her fame, but the way she navigated the long-term pressures that come with it. Many performers experience success, but far fewer manage to transform early recognition into sustained professional authority. Taylor's career offers a clear illustration of how that transformation can unfold over decades rather than moments. Managing success was the first challenge she faced. In Hollywood, visibility can arrive quickly, especially when a performer embodies an image that the industry finds commercially powerful. Yet the same visibility that accelerates opportunity can also narrow perception. In Taylor's case, early admiration centered heavily on appearance and presence. Instead of attempting to reject that attention outright, she allowed it to function as a foundation. Over time, she gradually expanded the narrative through performances that required depth, emotional intensity, and critical engagement. The lesson embedded in this stage of her career is that success often brings a label, and managing that label requires patience rather than confrontation. Protecting autonomy became the next phase of that process. As her reputation grew, Taylor entered a period when the balance of power between actors and studios was beginning to shift. What distinguished her career during this transition was her recognition that influence itself could become a strategic asset. By the time she reached mid-career, her name carried international weight. Rather than simply accepting the roles offered within the system, she used that visibility to negotiate greater control over the projects she joined and the conditions under which she worked. Autonomy, in this sense, was not a sudden declaration of independence. It was the gradual result of accumulated credibility and carefully exercised leverage. The third dimension of her career, sustaining relevance, may be the most difficult for any public figure. Industries evolve, audiences change, and the qualities that once defined success rarely remain constant. Taylor's later career suggests that longevity often depends on recognizing when influence can operate beyond the original medium that created it. As her film appearances became less frequent, her public platform expanded through humanitarian leadership and social advocacy. Rather than fading from public life, she repositioned her influence in ways that continued to resonate across generations. For viewers who have spent 20 or 30 years in their own professions, these patterns may feel familiar. Early success opens doors, but long-term authority comes from navigating a sequence of transitions, from recognition to credibility, from credibility to autonomy, and from autonomy to legacy. Each stage requires a different kind of decision-making. What once worked may eventually need to evolve. Looking at Elizabeth Taylor's career through this lens reveals something that is easy to miss when fame dominates the narrative. Beneath the spectacle of celebrity was a long process of professional positioning. She did not simply endure the pressures of public visibility, she gradually converted that visibility into leverage and then into influence. From a broader perspective, her career also reflects the changing nature of Hollywood itself. Taylor entered an industry defined by studio control and carefully managed star images. By the later stages of her career, actors were increasingly negotiating their own contracts, shaping their public identities, and influencing projects from positions of partnership rather than dependence. In many ways, her trajectory sits directly within that historical transition. If there is a larger takeaway from this story, it may be that longevity is rarely accidental. It emerges from the ability to recognize when circumstances are changing and to reposition oneself accordingly. Elizabeth Taylor's career demonstrates how public identity, professional strategy, and personal recalibration can interact across decades to produce something more durable than fame alone. And perhaps that is why her presence continues to invite reflection today. Not simply because she was one of Hollywood's most recognizable figures, but because her career raises a question that extends far beyond the film industry. How does someone remain both visible and in control as the world around them continues to evolve? If this kind of long career perspective interests you, consider staying with the channel as we continue exploring other figures whose professional journeys reveal how influence, autonomy, and legacy are built over time.